Hey everyone! Tonight we're heading back to a Britain where central heating didn't exist, supermarkets hadn't even been imagined, and your biggest winter luxury was discovering that your roof had decided to stay attached for another season. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull the blanket a little higher, and let your mind wander to a cold little village somewhere around the 6th or 7th century. Outside, the wind is pushing through bare trees. Smoke drifts lazily from thatched rooftops. Somebody is trying very hard to convince a stubborn goat that standing in the doorway is not actually an acceptable life choice. It's quiet, it's cold, and somehow people survive another winter. Tonight, we're simply going to spend some time with them. No frantic battles. No dramatic kings shouting speeches every 5 minutes. Just ordinary people making it through one very long season with patience, hard work, and an impressive willingness to accept that being permanently chilly was just part of life. Winter, for a dark age Britain, did not begin when snow started falling. It began months earlier, long before the first frost reached the fields. Everyone already knew what was coming. Summer wasn't simply pleasant weather. Summer was survival. Every sunny day represented another chance to gather hay, repair roofs, preserve food, mend tools, and prepare for months when almost nothing would grow. Modern life lets us imagine winter as something that arrives with festive decorations and warm drinks. Their version arrived carrying an enormous list of unpaid bills, because winter expected payment in food, every single day. The village itself looked surprisingly modest. No towering castles, no stone cathedrals. Those would come much later. Instead, there were clusters of timber buildings with walls woven from branches and coated in mud plaster. The roofs were thick with straw or reeds. From a distance, the houses almost seemed to grow out of the landscape. Inside, things were darker than most people imagine. Windows, if they existed at all, were tiny. Glass was extremely rare. An opening covered with shutters or cloth was much more common, which meant daylight entered only reluctantly. The center of the house usually belonged to the fire, not because people wanted cozy atmosphere, because without that fire, everything else became much harder. Cooking, drying clothes, heating, lighting, even preserving morale. The fire worked overtime. Of course, it also filled the room with smoke. The builders understood this. Smoke escaped through openings in the roof. Mostly, some of it preferred staying inside. It drifted lazily around the rafters before eventually deciding to leave. Living in a smoky house probably wasn't anyone's dream, but it did have one small advantage. The smoke discouraged insects and helped preserve the roof timbers. Sometimes history offers these strange little compromises. Congratulations. Your eyes sting, but your house lasts longer. Fair trade, apparently. As autumn faded, every household counted supplies. Grain, salt, beans, dried peas, cheese, smoked meat, ale, butter, anything capable of lasting until spring became valuable. Nothing could be wasted, not even slightly. A loaf dropped into the dirt wasn't just disappointing. It represented hours of labor. Months, really. Someone had plowed the field. Someone planted the grain. Someone protected it from birds. Someone harvested it. Someone ground it into flour using heavy millstones. Someone baked it. One careless moment erased an incredible amount of effort. Food had memory. Every meal reminded people how much work stood behind it. Livestock also became a complicated problem. Keeping animals alive through winter required food, but animals themselves consumed precious supplies. Every family had to make difficult decisions. Which animals should stay, which ones could not. It's an uncomfortable calculation, but a necessary one. Some animals were slaughtered before winter deepened. Their meat could be salted, smoked, or dried. Their hides became clothing. Their bones became tools. Very little disappeared without serving another purpose. Efficiency wasn't fashionable. It was unavoidable. Even pigs played an interesting role before winter arrived. Throughout autumn, they wandered woodlands, eating fallen acorns and beech nuts. They effectively gathered calories on their own. A remarkably sensible arrangement. The forest supplied food. The pigs converted it into future meals. Everybody participated. even if one participant spent most of the process enthusiastically sniffing leaves. Children also worked. Quite a lot. Modern childhood and dark age childhood were very different experiences. Young boys and girls collected firewood, watched animals, fetched water, helped process grain, learned countless practical skills. Not because adults wanted to be strict, because villages depended upon every capable pair of hands. Nobody expected perfection, but everyone expected contribution. As temperatures continued falling, daylight quietly disappeared. Not literally. It simply became scarce. A winter day felt surprisingly short. The sun rose late. It left early. Darkness occupied most of life. Candles existed. Oil lamps existed. Neither was free. Light itself carried expense, which meant people often followed natural daylight whenever possible. Once darkness settled over the village, activity slowed dramatically. There wasn't much point weaving cloth when you could barely see the loom. Repairing tools by dim firelight invited mistakes. So evenings became quieter. People talked, repaired simple objects, prepared food, shared stories already told hundreds of times. Nobody complained that they'd heard them before. The familiar stories mattered. They connected generations. One old tale, remembered around the fire, wasn't entertainment alone. It was continuity. Grandparents passed it to parents. Parents passed it to children. Children would someday repeat it themselves. History often survives because someone simply kept talking after sunset. Outside, winter gradually transformed the landscape. Fields looked empty. Trees stood silent. Roads became muddy. Travel slowed considerably. Sometimes villages remained surprisingly isolated for weeks. This made preparation even more important. You couldn't simply decide halfway through January that you'd forgotten something. There wasn't a convenient marketplace 20 minutes away. Well, not unless your definition of convenient included several freezing hours walking through mud while hoping nobody attempted to rob you, which most people understandably preferred to avoid. Clothing deserves more appreciation than it usually receives. Forget colorful medieval fantasy costumes. Daily clothing emphasized practicality. Dominated. Remained warm even when damp. And damp happened frequently. Britain has always displayed remarkable consistency regarding rain. Some traditions never change. Layers mattered. Simple tunics, heavy cloaks, leg wrappings, leather shoes, sometimes additional wool stuffed wherever possible. Fashion existed. Warmth usually won the argument. Rich people certainly owned finer garments, better dyes, better fabrics, more decoration. Winter, however, possessed an amusing lack of respect for social status. Cold air entered expensive sleeves almost as enthusiastically as cheap ones. The difference was that wealthy households generally enjoyed larger buildings, greater food supplies, and better opportunities to stay comfortable. Comfort, much like today, tended to appreciate financial support. One feature of many homes surprises modern visitors. People and animals often lived extremely close together, sometimes separated, sometimes not by very much. To modern sensibilities, this sounds rather unpleasant. To practical villagers, it made perfect sense. Animals produced heat. Heat was useful. Simple arithmetic occasionally defeated personal preference. If sharing part of a building with livestock improved everyone's chances of surviving until spring, well, the sheep were apparently acceptable roommates, even if they weren't especially considerate about personal space. Water created another challenge. Frozen streams, frozen buckets, frozen everything. Fetching water became harder precisely when people least wanted extra outdoor chores. Ice itself could become dangerous. A simple walk transformed into careful navigation. Broken bones healed slowly, sometimes not completely. Avoiding accidents mattered enormously. One careless slip could threaten an entire family's survival, because injured workers couldn't easily gather wood or care for animals. The village functioned as an interconnected system. Everyone relied upon everyone else. If one household struggled, neighbors often noticed. Not necessarily because society was perfectly kind. People certainly argued, disagreed, held grudges, complained about each other's pigs. Human nature has always remained wonderfully consistent, but survival encouraged cooperation. Helping today increased the likelihood someone might help tomorrow. Communities learned this lesson repeatedly. Winter made excellent teachers, and rather strict ones. So, as another cold evening settles over our little village, smoke curls slowly into the dark sky. Families gather close to the fire. The last meal of the day is simple, filling, and carefully measured. Outside, the wind continues its patient conversation with the trees. And tomorrow will look very much like today. For now, we'll leave them there, warm enough, fed enough, and hopeful that the stores laid aside during summer will carry them through until first green shoots of spring begin to appear. The strange thing about a dark age winter is that, after all the preparation, there was very little left to do except keep going. That probably sounds obvious. But imagine living through weeks where every morning looked almost exactly like the one before it. No electric lights, no television, no phones, no quick trips into town, because you suddenly felt like buying fresh bread. The weather decided your schedule. The daylight decided your working hours. And your food stores quietly counted down the days until spring. So if life in summer felt like a race, winter felt like an exercise in patience. An incredibly cold, slightly smoky, occasionally damp exercise in patience. Every morning usually began before sunrise, not because people loved waking early. Nobody has ever enthusiastically climbed out of a warm blanket into freezing air simply for fun. The animals still needed feeding. The fire needed attention. Water had to be collected. Someone needed to prepare the first meal. And if the fire had nearly gone out overnight, the entire house would greet the morning with the personality of a stone cellar. Keeping a fire alive sounds simple. It wasn't. Firewood represented weeks of labor. Trees had to be selected, branches cut, logs carried, wood stacked, then left to season whenever possible. Green wood burns poorly. It smokes more, produces less heat, and generally behaves like it's protesting the entire experience. Dry wood, on the other hand, was almost as valuable as food. Families watched their woodpile almost as carefully as their grain bins. Using too much in December could create frightening problems in February. Everything became a calculation. Should another log be added now or saved for later? Would tonight be colder? Would tomorrow bring snow? Nobody knew, so people guessed. Hopefully well. Cooking reflected the same careful thinking. Breakfast wasn't a grand affair. Usually some kind of porridge, barley, oats, sometimes rye, occasionally flavored with onions, herbs, or whatever happened to be available. Honey was wonderful, but precious. Butter made everything taste better. Also precious. Cheese added richness. Again, precious. You may notice a pattern developing. Almost everything tasted wonderful. Mostly because almost everything required months of work. One meal could easily blur into the next. Porridge today, porridge tomorrow, slightly different porridge next Tuesday. Luxury often meant the porridge contained something interesting, perhaps dried apples, perhaps hazelnuts, perhaps the exciting discovery that someone found a forgotten piece of smoked bacon. History's greatest surprises are not always dramatic. Sometimes they're simply delicious. Bread remained one of the great foundations of daily life. But not every loaf resembled the fluffy white bread many people know today. Grain quality varied. Flour often contained tiny bits of grit from the grinding stones, which meant people's teeth slowly paid the price. Archaeologists frequently noticed significant dental wear on medieval skeletons. Imagine chewing tiny amount of stone every day for decades. Your dentist would probably have some concerns. Assuming dentists existed, which, in the modern sense, not exactly. Fortunately for everyone involved, dentistry remained a problem for another era. Inside the home, warmth gathered only near the fire. Move a few steps away, and the temperature could drop noticeably. The larger the building, the more obvious this became. Heat simply wandered upward into the roof, while everyone below tried not to think about it. Blankets helped. Animal skins helped. Sleeping close together helped. Privacy wasn't a major architectural feature. Families often shared sleeping spaces. Children slept beside parents. Relatives stayed together. Body heat became another household resource. It may not sound glamorous. Neither was freezing. People generally chose a less unpleasant option. Now let's drift over to one of winter's quieter companions. Darkness. Modern cities rarely become truly dark. Streetlights glow. Buildings shine. Cars pass. Screens illuminate faces at every hour. Dark Age Britain offered something different. When the fire burned low, night truly arrived. Outside, the countryside disappeared. The stars became astonishingly bright. On clear evenings, the Milky Way stretched overhead with remarkable clarity. People knew those skies intimately, not because they were amateur astronomers, because they lived beneath them every single night. The moon mattered. A bright full moon transformed travel. A cloudy night made even familiar paths surprisingly dangerous. It's easy to underestimate how much artificial lighting has changed human life. For them, darkness wasn't simply the absence of light. It was another environment altogether, one entered carefully. Villages also sounded different during winter. Summer buzzed with insects, birdsong, harvest work, children playing outside. Winter replaced all of that with quieter noises. Wind pushing against timber walls. A dog barking somewhere beyond the houses. The occasional sheep complaining about absolutely everything. Some things truly are timeless. Inside, conversation filled much of the evening. Stories mixed history with legend. Old family memories blended with local myths. Saints appeared alongside ancient heroes. Roman ruins inspired mysterious explanations. Nobody possessed Google, so stories naturally grew around unanswered questions. Imagine discovering the remains of an enormous Roman villa centuries after its owners disappeared. Massive stone walls, broken mosaics, collapsed baths. To villagers living in timber houses, these ruins must have seemed almost magical. Who built this place? Why had they left? Could giants have lived here? Perhaps forgotten kings? Perhaps people favored by God? Perhaps simply Romans with unusually ambitious building projects? The answer depended on whom you asked, and every storyteller probably added their own favorite details. Children listened carefully, not because they expected examinations afterward, because winter evenings invited imagination. The world beyond the village remained enormous and mysterious. Most people never traveled very far. A journey of 30 or 40 miles could feel substantial. The king might exist. Nearby monasteries certainly existed. Great towns survived. But daily life revolved around fields, forests, rivers, and neighboring villages. Your world remained comfortably small, and perhaps a little safer because of it. Although safe deserves careful definition. Illness remained one of winter's greatest concerns. A simple cough, a fever, an infected wound. Today, these often mean inconvenience. Then they carried genuine uncertainty. Medical knowledge certainly existed. Herbal remedies helped. Wise healers accumulated generations of practical experience. Monasteries preserved valuable medical texts. But treatments varied enormously. Some worked surprisingly well. Others, let's politely describe them as optimistic. Honey, for example, possessed genuine antibacterial qualities. Certain herbs ease pain or digestion. Willow bark contained compounds related to aspirin. Experience taught useful lessons. Unfortunately, experience also occasionally suggested ideas that had considerably less scientific support. History can be wonderfully practical one moment and deeply confusing the next. Prayer also played an important role. Christianity had spread across much of Britain, though older beliefs lingered in various places. Faith shaped everyday routines. People prayed before meals, during illness, before journeys, after successful harvests, when storms threatened. Religion wasn't separated from daily life. It surrounded it. Monasteries became places of learning, worship, hospitality, and charity. A traveler reaching one during winter might receive food and shelter, not because life was easy, because kindness itself became a duty. Of course, monks also experienced winter. Even devoted scholars had to fetch water, repair roofs, stack firewood. Copying manuscripts beside a chilly window probably sounded far more romantic than it actually felt. Imagine spending hours carefully writing beautiful Latin letters while your fingers slowly forgot what warmth was. Dedication deserves respect, especially frozen dedication. Clothing required constant maintenance. Wool wore out, leather cracked, shoes split. A small tear ignored today could become a large problem next week. Needles rarely rested for long. Sewing wasn't simply domestic decoration. It kept people alive. Every repaired cloak represented another barrier against icy winds. Every patched sock meant warmer feet. Winter rewarded those who noticed small problems before they became large ones. Even tools demanded attention. Axes needed sharpening, knives repaired, wooden handles replaced. Iron was valuable. A damaged tool wasn't casually thrown away. It was repaired, again and again, until there was almost nothing left to repair. Modern culture often celebrates buying new things. Dark Age Britons specialized in making old things continue working for astonishing lengths of time. Waste simply cost too much. Meanwhile, outside the village, forests rested beneath bare branches. Many animals became harder to find. Hunters still ventured out whenever opportunities appeared. A successful hunt could dramatically improve everyone's meals. But hunting required skill, patience, and luck. Plenty of trips ended with nothing more exciting than cold feet. Still, people kept trying, because eventually someone returned carrying a deer, or several rabbits, or wild birds. Hope remained an important hunting companion. Dogs helped enormously. Not pampered household pets sleeping on embroidered cushions. Working animals, tracking scents, guarding homes, helping with livestock, sharing in the daily routines of village life. Their jobs mattered. Though one suspects, they also accepted occasional scratches behind the ears whenever possible. Cats likely lived nearby as well, mostly employed in the ancient and honorable profession of discouraging mice from developing unrealistic ambitions regarding the grain stores. A hard-working cat probably earned its keep many times over. Nobody wanted hungry rodents conducting midnight banquets inside precious food supplies. By the middle of winter, people had settled into a rhythm. Wake, feed the fire, feed the animals, prepare food, repair, spin wool, weave cloth, tell stories, sleep, repeat. It sounds repetitive, because it was. But repetition itself carried comfort. Routine meant survival. Every ordinary day completed successfully brought spring one day closer. Nobody expected excitement. Excitement usually meant something had gone wrong. A collapsed roof, an injured ox, a missing child, a spoiled food barrel. Quiet days were good days, very good days. And so, while snow drifts quietly across the fields outside our little village, another evening settles over Britain. The fire crackles softly. Someone gently stirs tomorrow's pot. A grandmother continues a story she's probably told 50 winters before. A child pretends not to know the ending, mostly because hearing it one more time feels reassuring. Outside, the stars slowly wheel above the sleeping countryside. Inside, ordinary people continue doing what generations before them had done, not making history, simply surviving it. And for now, that is more than enough. By the time the deepest part of winter settled over Britain, something curious happened. Nobody really asked when spring would arrive anymore, not because they had stopped hoping. Quite the opposite. They hoped for it constantly. They simply knew that asking every day wouldn't make it come any faster. So life became wonderfully ordinary. The same fire, the same smoky rafters, the same muddy boots waiting beside the doorway, the same wooden bowls that had somehow survived another year without cracking. Winter had a way of shrinking the world, not physically, mentally. Instead of worrying about kingdoms or distant rulers, most people concentrated on questions that felt much closer to home. Is there enough barley left? Will the cow stay healthy? Can we stretch this cheese for another week? Did someone remember to bring in the last bundle of firewood before the snow? Those questions mattered far more than who happened to be wearing a crown somewhere hundreds of miles away. Kings might argue over borders. Villagers argued over whether someone had accidentally used a better cooking pot. History books tend to remember one of those. Daily life remembered the other. One of the greatest skills a Dark Age household could possess was knowing how to make ordinary food seem slightly less ordinary. That sounds impossible, but people became surprisingly creative. A simple pot of stew might contain barley one day, oats the next, a handful of dried peas after that, perhaps some onions if supplies allowed. A few herbs collected during summer could completely change the flavor. Leeks were popular. Wild garlic added welcome taste. Parsley appeared whenever someone had managed to preserve it. Even a pinch of mustard seed could make people briefly forget they had eaten almost the same meal yesterday, and the day before, and, if we're being honest, probably last Tuesday as well. Salt was one of the household treasures. Not glamorous, not exciting, certainly not the sort of thing anyone today unwraps with dramatic music playing in the background, but absolutely essential. Without salt, preserving meat became much harder. Without preserved meat, winter became much longer. Salt quietly supported civilization, while asking for almost no recognition. Rather humble, really. Of course, people didn't simply eat whenever they felt slightly peckish. Food followed rhythm. Meals were measured, portions carefully considered. Every slice of bread represented future calculations. If everyone ate a little extra tonight, tomorrow's supplies became slightly smaller. Multiply that over several months, and suddenly optimism had turned into hunger. Planning mattered. Very few households enjoyed the luxury of abundance. Most aimed for something far more realistic. Enough grain, enough wood, enough candles, enough luck. Sometimes history is less about greatness and more about having just enough of everything. Animals continue to occupy an important place in village life throughout winter. The chickens still produced eggs from time to time, although fewer than during warmer months. The pigs, if any remain alive after autumn slaughtering, needed feeding. The sheep required watching. Goats, meanwhile, continued demonstrating an impressive commitment to climbing onto things they absolutely did not need to climb onto. Some traditions stretched back many centuries. Cows were especially valuable. Milk could become butter. Butter could become food during difficult weeks. Cheese lasted far longer than fresh milk. Nothing happened by accident. Every product represented another layer of careful planning. When archaeologists uncover old farmsteads, they often find evidence of dairying. Simple pottery, storage vessels, fragments of churns, tiny clues that reveal enormous amounts about daily survival. History is surprisingly good at hiding itself inside broken pots. Speaking of pottery, imagine trying to cook without metal saucepans stacked neatly inside kitchen cupboards. Clay pots did most of the work. Some cracked, some survived for years. Iron cauldrons existed but represented significant wealth. If a family owned one, they looked after it carefully, very carefully. Nobody casually left expensive cookware outside overnight. Winter weather had enough bad habits already. The village blacksmith remained one of the busiest people around, even during colder months. Tools broke, hinges bent, knives dulled, axes chipped. The blacksmith transformed damaged iron into useful objects once again. To modern eyes, the forge must have seemed almost magical. Dark workshop, glowing coals, sparks dancing through smoky air, a lump of dull metal entering the fire, a sharpened tool emerging minutes later. It's not difficult to imagine children watching with enormous fascination. Adults, too, if we're honest. Fire changing stone like iron into something soft enough to shape. It certainly looked impressive. The blacksmith probably appreciated the admiration, though he may have appreciated payment even more. Payment didn't always mean coins. Coins certainly existed, especially in larger settlements and among wealthier people. But everyday exchange frequently relied upon goods. Grain, cheese, wool, labor. One family repaired another family's fence. Someone else helped during lambing season. Communities functioned through countless little exchanges that rarely appeared in official records. No king ever issued a grand proclamation celebrating Margaret, lending Edith a basket of onions. Yet that sort of thing probably happened all the time, and it mattered, perhaps more than many royal decrees. Let's wander outside for a moment. The landscape itself looked remarkably different from modern Britain. Large forests covered far more land. Marshes spread across low areas. Rivers followed natural courses without concrete banks telling them where to behave. Wildlife was abundant. Red deer moved through woodland. Wild boar rooted beneath oak trees. Wolves still survived in parts of Britain, not constantly lurking outside every village like characters in fairy tales, but certainly present. Mostly, they preferred avoiding people, which, considering humans had spears and a rather suspicious attitude toward wolves, was probably sensible. Foxes visited farms whenever opportunities appeared. Ravens circled overhead. Owls hunted quietly after sunset. Winter stripped leaves from the trees, making the countryside feel larger somehow. You could see farther, hear farther. A dog barking across frozen fields carried surprising distances. Travel, however, remained difficult. Roads inherited from Roman Britain still existed in places. Some remained useful. Others slowly disappeared beneath centuries of neglect. A Roman engineer would probably have mixed feelings. Good news, someone might tell him. People still use your road. Wonderful. The bad news is, well, look at it. Mud ruled many journeys. Snow complicated others. River crossings demanded caution. Bridges weren't guaranteed. Sometimes people simply waited for better weather. Patience frequently proved the safest transportation strategy. Visitors arriving during winter brought news. And news was precious. A traveler might speak of another kingdom, a monastery several days away, a local lord settling disputes, a market held before heavy snow arrived. Ordinary conversation became something rather valuable. Imagine hearing fresh stories after weeks spent with the same 50 neighbors. The excitement remained politely restrained, of course. This is still a sleepy history story. Nobody leaped dramatically onto tables shouting, "Tell us everything." They probably just moved a little closer to the fire, which was sensible regardless. Hospitality mattered. Offering food to travelers reflected both practical kindness and Christian teaching. Besides, guests often carried information. Information traveled on tired feet. Winter also encouraged craftsmanship. When fields rested, hands stayed busy indoors. Women spun wool into thread. Men repaired wooden tools. Children learned by watching. Skills passed quietly between generations. Nobody announced, "Today begins Lesson 3 in Advanced Basket Weaving." You simply watched, tried, made mistakes, tried again. Eventually your basket stopped looking like something assembled by a particularly confused goose. Experience remained the greatest teacher available. Clothing production occupied astonishing amounts of time. First came shearing sheep. Months earlier, of course. Then cleaning the wool. Removing dirt. Removing bits of straw. Removing everything sheep naturally considered decorative. Next came carding. Then spinning. Then weaving. Only after all that could someone actually begin sewing garments. A single cloak represented countless hours of work, which explains why people repaired clothes instead of throwing them away. Modern wardrobes might puzzle a Dark Age family enormously. You own 20 coats? Yes. Why? Because they were on sale. Silence. Long, thoughtful silence. The concept would require some adjustment. Children grew quickly, creating another challenge. Shoes became too small. Tunics too short. Sleeves mysteriously climbed toward elbows. Parents altered clothing whenever possible. Fabric simply couldn't be wasted. Every scrap found another purpose. Patches, blankets, bandages, cleaning cloths. Even tiny pieces remained useful. Waste belonged to wealthier societies. Resourcefulness belonged to everyone else. The weather itself remained wonderfully unpredictable. One week brought crisp, clear mornings where frost sparkled across every field. The next brought relentless rain turning pathways into thick brown soup. British weather was already perfecting its reputation. Some things apparently required no historical development whatsoever. People adapted, because adaptation was easier than complaining to the clouds. Although one suspects plenty of complaining happened anyway. Quietly, mostly while carrying buckets. As evening approached once again, smoke drifted from every roof. The smell of burning oak and hazel would settle gently across the village. Doors closed against the wind. Animals grew quiet. The stars slowly returned above a world lit almost entirely by firelight. Inside each house, another simple meal waited, another story, another careful count of supplies, another ordinary day successfully completed. No statues would ever celebrate these evenings. No monks would write glorious chronicles describing them. No royal poet would compose songs about someone successfully mending a wool sock before bedtime. Yet these unnoticed moments form the true foundation of history. Because kingdoms only existed if ordinary people survived winters like this one. And quietly, patiently, without expecting applause, they did. If you could quietly step to the doorway of a dark-age British home on a freezing January evening, the first thing you would notice probably wouldn't be the people. It would be the smell. History rarely smells the way movies suggest. There wouldn't be a dramatic cloud of mysterious medieval perfume hanging in the air. Instead, you'd be greeted by a complicated mixture with smoke, damp wool, fresh bread if you were lucky, simmering barley, leather, wet boots, straw, and a faint hint of whichever farm animal had wandered just close enough to remind everyone that personal boundaries were a fairly modern invention. Oddly enough, after a few hours, your brain would probably stop noticing most of it. Humans are remarkably adaptable. Spend enough time anywhere, and eventually your nose quietly resigns itself to the situation. The house itself wasn't large. Not tiny exactly, just efficient. Every bit of space needed to justify its existence. Furniture was surprisingly limited. A few benches, a sturdy table, storage chests, shelves built directly into the walls, sleeping platforms or simple straw mattresses. Nothing sat around merely looking decorative. If something occupied space, it usually had a job. Modern homes often contain furniture whose primary purpose seems to be reminding visitors that someone once had excellent taste while shopping. Dark Age furniture preferred contributing to survival. The floor was usually packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. These weren't simply scattered around for decoration. Fresh rushes helped absorb moisture, added insulation, and made the room slightly more comfortable. Every so often they were replaced. Not as frequently as modern carpets get vacuumed, but often enough to keep things reasonably livable. Reasonably. That's doing a lot of work in that sentence. Above everyone's head stretched thick wooden beams blackened by decades of smoke. The rafters became useful storage space. Bundles of herbs hung upside down to dry. Garlic, onions, occasionally strips of smoked meat. Anything lifted away from curious dogs, determined mice, and adventurous children immediately enjoyed a longer life expectancy. Smoke drifting upward also helped preserve many of these foods. Again, smoke managed to perform several jobs at once: heating, preserving, discouraging insects, making everyone smell faintly like a campfire. Quite the multitasker. The fireplace itself wasn't always a fireplace in the way we imagine today. Many houses simply had an open hearth in the middle of the room. The smoke escaped through roof openings. Mostly, on windy days, however, smoke occasionally changed its mind and explored the rest of the house first. Everyone calmly accepted this. There wasn't much alternative. You couldn't exactly phone a chimney specialist. Hello. Yes, my smoke appears to be behaving rather creatively. People simply adjusted. Eyes watered. Someone shifted a log. Life continued. Cooking remained wonderfully uncomplicated. One pot, many meals. Stews quietly simmer for hours, sometimes longer. Ingredients came and went depending on availability. A little grain, some vegetables, perhaps leftover meat, perhaps not. Nothing complicated. Just nourishing food that filled stomachs and stretched precious supplies. The household spoon became surprisingly important. Knives existed. People carried them regularly. Forks, however, had not yet become everyday table companions. Most eating involved spoons, fingers, and practical experience. Children learned quickly. Dropping dinner into the fire represented a deeply unpopular decision. Speaking of children, they rarely remained still. Just like today, parents 800 or 1,000 years ago probably repeated exactly the same requests modern parents still use. Don't touch that. Come back here. Leave the chicken alone. Although admittedly, modern children encounter fewer indoor chickens. Usually, Winter meant children spent more time inside. That required creativity. Games certainly existed. Simple toys existed too. Carved wooden figures. Balls made from scraps of leather stuffed with wool. Dice. Small carved animals. Nothing extravagant. Imagination supplied whatever craftsmanship could not. A simple stick became a horse. A pebble became treasure. Children have always been remarkably efficient at inventing worlds from almost nothing. Adults, meanwhile, rarely enjoyed uninterrupted leisure. Hands stayed busy. Someone spun wool. Someone repaired clothing. Someone sharpened tools using a whetstone. Someone twisted rope from plant fibers. Somebody else carved replacement handles for broken farming equipment. Conversation drifted naturally around these activities. Nobody scheduled family meetings. People simply talked while working. Plans for spring. News from neighboring villages. Concerns about livestock. Stories about grandparents. Occasionally, someone remembered a local legend that had grown slightly more dramatic each time it was told. Not intentionally. Stories simply enjoy stretching their legs after enough years. Let's float over to another little piece of winter life that often gets forgotten. Laundry. Now, modern washing machines are wonderfully boring. You press a button, walk away, return later. Everything is mostly clean. Dark Age laundry possessed considerably more personality. Water had to be collected, heated. Soap, if available, was made from animal fat and ash. Clothes were scrubbed by hand, rinsed, wrung out, then dried, which sounds perfectly manageable until you remember it's the middle of winter. Drying thick wool indoors wasn't exactly quick. Many garments simply remained slightly damp for longer than anyone preferred. Dry enough became an acceptable standard. Perfectly dry was occasionally an ambitious dream. Speaking of wool, it deserves another moment of appreciation. Without sheep, life became dramatically harder. Their wool became blankets, tunics, hoods, cloaks, socks, mittens, almost everything between your skin, and the winter air probably involved sheep somewhere along the journey. The sheep themselves, meanwhile, spent much of their lives blissfully unaware they were quietly supporting civilization. One almost feels they deserve a small round of applause, though they would probably settle for another patch of grass. Leather proved equally valuable. Shoes, belts, pouches, scabbards, harnesses, buckets. Leather quietly appeared everywhere. Tanning hides required unpleasant work and impressive patience. The finished product justified the effort. Nothing from a slaughtered animal disappeared without purpose. Meat fed families. Bones became needles, combs, and tools. Sinew became thread. Horn became drinking cups. Even hooves found uses. Modern recycling campaigns would have admired the efficiency. Waste simply wasn't affordable. One surprisingly precious object in many homes was the storage chest. At first glance, it looked rather ordinary, just a sturdy wooden box. But inside rested the family's valuable possessions, extra clothing, important tools, perhaps a few silver coins, family heirlooms, maybe a beautifully carved brooch handed down through generations, perhaps a small Christian cross, perhaps an old Roman coin kept simply because it looked fascinating. Objects carried stories. A simple knife might have belonged to someone's grandfather. A cloak pin might remind everyone of a wedding decades earlier. Memory often lived inside ordinary belongings. Winter evenings encouraged people to remember. Without constant distractions, conversations wandered naturally into the past. Do you remember the Great Storm? The harvest when everyone thought the barley had failed? The winter the river froze completely? Each generation quietly collected its own catalog of difficult years. Older villagers became living libraries, not because they had read many books. Most hadn't, because they had lived long enough to remember. Experience itself became knowledge. Gray hair represented survival. There was respect in that. Of course, not every evening remained peaceful. People argued. Brothers disagreed. Children complained. Neighbors occasionally offended one another over fences. Wandering pigs borrowed tools, or whose goat had somehow ended up eating someone else's carefully protected vegetables. Goats have demonstrated remarkable commitment to causing entirely avoidable diplomatic incidents throughout history. One suspects they enjoy the challenge. Still, disagreements rarely lasted forever. Village life required cooperation. Holding a grudge became exhausting when you still needed help repairing your roof next month. Practicality frequently defeated pride, sometimes reluctantly. As night settled fully outside, someone carefully checked the fire one last time. Fresh logs were added, ashes arranged. Not enough fuel to waste valuable wood. Not so little that everyone woke freezing before dawn. Finding that balance required years of experience. Too much heat consumed tomorrow's firewood. Too little invited a thoroughly miserable morning. Small decisions quietly shaped survival. Eventually conversations slowed. One by one, people wrapped themselves beneath heavy wool blankets and animal skins. The fire glowed softly in the darkness. Occasionally someone coughed. Somewhere outside, an owl called into the cold night. The wind gently nudged the thatched roof overhead. Tomorrow would almost certainly resemble today. The same work, the same food, the same careful routines. To us, that repetition might sound dull. To them, it was reassuring. Routine meant the house was still standing. The family was still together. The food stores still held. The fire still burned. And in a dark age winter, those ordinary victories were more than enough. Because survival rarely arrived with trumpets. More often, it arrived quietly, one peaceful evening at a time. If there was one thing that quietly ruled a dark age winter, it wasn't the king. It wasn't the village elder. It wasn't even the weather. It was fire. Without a steady fire, almost every part of daily life became more difficult. Food became harder to cook. Clothes stayed damp. Hands stiffened. Water froze. Children cried more often. Older people struggled. The house itself somehow felt smaller, as if the cold slowly pushed everyone toward the glowing center of the room. That little orange circle of warmth wasn't simply comforting. It was the heart of the household. Everything seemed to orbit around it, and keeping it alive required an astonishing amount of work. Today, if your home gets chilly, you might turn a thermostat a few degrees higher. Perhaps you'll complain that the heating bill is outrageous. Perhaps you'll put on a sweater while waiting. Either way, warmth usually arrives with the press of a button. A dark age family had a rather different customer service experience. If the fire was dying, somebody had to fix it, personally, immediately. The first challenge was gathering enough wood before winter even arrived. This wasn't a weekend hobby. It was one of the year's biggest jobs. Throughout late summer and autumn, families headed into nearby woodlands carrying axes, ropes, and plenty of determination. They searched for fallen branches, dead trees, and timber suitable for splitting. Healthy forests had to be treated carefully. Nobody wanted to strip away every useful tree. After all, next winter was already waiting somewhere in the future. Forests were long-term investments. Cut too much today, and tomorrow became considerably colder. Many communities understood this surprisingly well. Certain woods were left alone. Others were harvested carefully. Experience had taught generations how easily greed could create hardship. Not every log burned the same way. Oak was excellent, dense, long-burning, reliable. Ash also made wonderful firewood. Hazel burned well. Birch caught fire quickly and helped start larger logs. Willow, however, often contained more moisture and tended to burn less enthusiastically. Every tree seemed to have its own personality. Some behaved like dependable old friends. Others acted as though being set on fire was an unreasonable inconvenience. Once cut, the wood couldn't simply be thrown into a pile and forgotten. Freshly cut timber held a surprising amount of water. Green wood hissed, smoked heavily, produced less heat. Seasoned wood, left dry over many months, burned much better. This meant people constantly thought ahead. The fire warming your house this January may have begun its journey as a tree more than a year earlier. Warmth required patience. There's something oddly comforting about that. Entire summers quietly transformed into future winters. Wood piles became symbols of security. A large, neatly stacked pile suggested careful planning. A shrinking one caused quiet concern. Nobody announced it dramatically. No one stood in the middle of the village shouting, We only have 43 logs remaining. Instead, people simply noticed. Perhaps another log wasn't added to the fire that evening. Perhaps blankets were wrapped a little tighter. Perhaps supper was cooked more efficiently. Tiny adjustments stretched supplies one day further. Survival often depended on hundreds of little decisions rather than one heroic moment. The fire itself demanded constant attention. Someone always seemed to be checking it, poking glowing embers with an iron rod, adding another split log, moving burning wood closer together, sweeping away excess ash. It became almost second nature, like breathing or blinking. Nobody proudly declared, "I successfully maintained the fire today." That was simply expected. Of course, accidents happened. A spark could jump farther than expected. Thatched roofs, dry straw, wooden walls. None of these were particularly enthusiastic about meeting open flames. Entire villages understood the danger. Buckets of water stood ready whenever possible. People remained cautious. A single careless moment could erase years of work. Fire was both protector and threat. History often enjoys presenting these uncomfortable partnerships. Outside, the woods looked completely different during winter. Without leaves, the trees revealed their true shapes. Twisted branches stretched against pale skies. Old oaks appeared almost ancient enough to remember the Romans. Beech trees stood smooth and silent. Evergreens added patches of stubborn green among otherwise sleeping forests. Walking through these woods could feel strangely peaceful. Snow softened every sound. Footsteps became muffled. Birdsong grew quieter. Even the wind seemed to whisper rather than shout, provided, of course, you ignore the occasional branch dropping a surprising amount of snow directly onto your shoulders. The forest had an excellent sense of timing. Gathering firewood during winter still happened when necessary. Storms frequently knocked branches down. Deadwood remained useful, but winter trips required caution. The ground became slippery. Hidden roots lurked beneath snow. Streams that looked safely frozen occasionally held rather different opinions. Experience mattered enormously. Older villagers knew which paths stayed reliable, which hills became dangerous, which parts of the forest should probably wait until spring. Knowledge of the landscape passed naturally between generations. Nobody handed children a beautifully illustrated guidebook titled 100 Helpful Woodland Tips. Instead, fathers, mothers, grandparents, uncles, and neighbors simply pointed things out. Don't cross there. That tree is hollow. The ground floods after heavy rain. Listen for cracking ice. Simple lessons, repeated often, remembered for life. The forest also supplied far more than firewood. Hazel branches became fencing. Straight saplings became tool handles. Tree bark occasionally found medicinal uses. Mushrooms appeared during warmer months. Berries were gathered before winter. Acorns fed pigs. Nature wasn't simply scenery. It functioned as a village's enormous outdoor storeroom. Respecting it wasn't romantic. It was practical. Let's quietly wander back into the house. The firelight transformed everything. Walls glowed amber. Shadows stretched lazily across wooden beams. Faces softened beneath flickering light. There were no bright ceiling lamps exposing every corner. Darkness remained part of the room. The fire illuminated only what truly mattered. Modern lighting reveals everything. Firelight suggests. Perhaps that's one reason old stories feel so comfortable beside a hearth. Mystery naturally lives in shadows. As evening continued, someone might place a simple iron pot above the flames. Inside, yesterday's stew quietly became tonight's supper. This happened more often than modern refrigerators might approve of, but constant reheating kept food edible. Nothing went to waste. The stew simply evolved. Yesterday's vegetables welcomed today's barley. Today's leftovers prepared for tomorrow. It became less of a recipe and more of an ongoing conversation between ingredients. Some historians jokingly call this sort of meal a perpetual stew. The name feels surprisingly accurate. One suspects every household insisted theirs tasted slightly better than the neighbors. Whether that was objectively true remains politely impossible to prove. Cooking also produced another valuable gift: warmth. Even simple bread baking made the house feel noticeably more comfortable. Clay ovens retained heat long after the loaves emerged. Nothing was wasted. Heat worked twice, first for food, then for comfort. Efficiency quietly shaped almost every household decision. Candles, meanwhile, remained precious. Most ordinary families couldn't afford to burn them carelessly. Animal fat candles produce light. They also produce smoke and a rather distinctive smell. Beeswax candles smelled much nicer. Unfortunately, bees generally reserve those for wealthier households and churches. Life has always offered premium versions of ordinary products. Some things never change. Instead, many evenings relied primarily upon firelight. That gentle glow encouraged slower conversations, quieter voices, long pauses. Nobody hurried very much. There was little reason to. Tomorrow's sunrise would arrive whether anyone rushed or not. As midnight slowly approached, the village settled into remarkable silence. No engines, no aircraft, no distant highways. Only wind, perhaps an owl, maybe a fox calling somewhere beyond the fields. Occasionally a restless cow, reminding everyone that she remained very much awake. The stars above Britain stretched from one horizon to the other without interruption, brighter than most of us have ever seen, more numerous than city dwellers might imagine. For many people, those stars became familiar companions through countless winters. Some helped travelers, some inspired stories, some simply reminded people how vast the world remained beyond their little village. Eventually, the last conversation faded. The fire settled into glowing embers. Blankets rustled. The house became still. Outside, frost slowly covered the fields once again. Inside, the warmth held on for another few precious hours. And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, spring continued its slow, patient journey toward Britain. Not in a hurry, never in a hurry, but coming all the same. If someone from modern Britain suddenly found themselves standing in a dark age village on a freezing January morning, they would probably discover something within the first 5 minutes. One layer of clothing would not be enough. Neither would two. And after another few minutes, they might begin looking suspiciously at every sheep in the area with newfound appreciation, because sheep, more than almost any other animal, quietly made winter survival possible. Before we continue, take a slow look around our little village again. The sun has finally climbed above the horizon, not very high. Winter sunlight in Britain has a habit of looking as though it hasn't quite decided whether it's worth making the effort. The fields are silver with frost. Thin curls of smoke rise from every roof. A rooster proudly announces the morning as though he personally arranged for it to happen. Nobody argues with him. It seems easy that way. People step outside wrapped in heavy wool cloaks, their breath drifting to the cold air in little white clouds. No one looks especially fashionable by modern standards, and that is entirely the point. Warmth has defeated style by unanimous decision. The first layer of clothing was usually a simple linen shirt. Linen came from flax, not sheep. It rested comfortably against the skin and absorbed sweat surprisingly well. That mattered more than it might sound. Even in winter, people work hard, carrying buckets, splitting wood, feeding livestock, repairing fences. Physical work generated heat. Too much sweating could become dangerous if damp clothing later cooled against the skin. Experienced people understood this without needing scientific explanations. Generations of observation had already taught the lesson. Over the linen came wool, then perhaps more wool, a thicker tunic, a cloak, leg wrappings, maybe an extra hood if the wind became particularly determined. Wool trapped warm air beautifully. Even better, it continued insulating when slightly damp. Considering Britain's relationship with rain, this was an exceptionally useful quality. If wool had been capable of writing advertisements, they practically would have written themselves. Still warm, even after another rainy afternoon. People probably would have believed every word. Creating that wool, however, required astonishing amount of effort. Long before winter arrived, sheep were carefully sheared. Not too early, not too late. The fleece had to be cleaned. Anyone who has spent time around sheep will know they possess many wonderful qualities. Remaining spotless is not traditionally among them. The raw will contain dirt, bits of grass, seeds, natural oils, small twigs, and enough surprises to keep everyone occupied. After cleaning came carding. Wooden tools covered with rows of fine teeth gradually aligned the fibers. Then spinning. This transformed loose wool into thread. A spindle twirled patiently between practiced fingers. Round and round, hour after hour. What looks almost effortless today represented years of learned skill. Many women became astonishingly fast. Their hands seemed to work almost automatically while conversations continued around them. Spinning wasn't treated as a special occasion. It filled spare moments. Waiting for supper, watching children, talking with neighbors. Wherever hands remained free, thread quietly appeared. The thread eventually reached the loom. Weaving demanded concentration. One thread crossed another. Then another. Slowly, cloth emerged. A cloak began not as clothing, but as thousands upon thousands of tiny movements. One thread at a time. Looking at a finished garment, it's easy to forget the invisible hours hidden inside it. Every stitch represented someone's afternoon, perhaps several afternoons. A good cloak became one of the most valuable possessions a person owned, not because it looked impressive, because it kept the wind out. There are few compliments greater than that during a dark age winter. Children inherited clothing whenever possible. An older brother outgrew a tunic. It passed to a younger brother. A daughter inherited a cousin's cloak. Sleeves were shortened, hems adjusted, patches added. Fabric lived many different lives before finally wearing out. Modern wardrobes often celebrate variety. Dark Age wardrobes celebrated endurance. If a garment survived 10 winters, it had earned considerable respect. Repairing clothes happened constantly. Needles made from bone or iron stitched tears before they grew larger. Loose seams received immediate attention. A ripped cloak ignored for several days could become an unpleasant companion during icy winds. Small repairs prevented larger disasters. That philosophy extended well beyond clothing. It described much of daily life. Take care of little problems early. Future you will be grateful. Footwear deserves special sympathy. Shoes usually consisted of leather. Practical, durable, reasonably waterproof, at least at first. Unfortunately, leather and mud developed a rather close relationship during British winters. Roads became wet, fields became muddy. Footpaths transformed into slippery ribbons winding through the countryside. Keeping feet dry often proved impossible. People accepted damp boots with the same weary patience modern commuters reserve for traffic jams. Complaining accomplished very little. Some travelers wrapped strips of wool around their lower legs beneath leather footwear. Others stuffed extra wool inside shoes for additional warmth. Ingenious? Certainly. Luxurious? Not exactly. Still, cold toes have inspired practical thinking throughout human history. Leather itself required enormous effort to produce. Fresh hides could not simply become shoes overnight. Tanning transformed them into useful material. The process involved soaking, scraping, stretching, and more than a little unpleasant smell. It wasn't glamorous work. The finished leather, however, justified every difficult step. Belts held clothing together. Small leather pouches carried knives, coins, or bits of food. Leather straps secured loads onto animals. Harnesses connected oxen to plows. Without leather, everyday life slowed considerably. Now let's wander over to one of the village's quieter workers, the tailor, or rather, whoever happened to possess the greatest sewing skill. Not every village had someone whose only occupation involved clothing. Most communities were too small. Instead, talented individuals naturally became known for particular abilities. One person carved excellent bowls. Another sharpened tools beautifully. Someone else consistently produced the warmest cloaks. People remembered these things. Reputation traveled surprisingly well without advertisements. Go see Edith. She fixes sleeves properly. Simple, direct, entirely sufficient. Color existed, though perhaps not quite as brilliantly as modern fantasy films suggest. Natural dyes produced earthy reds, yellows, greens, and blues. Some colors remained expensive. Others faded quickly after repeated washing. Bright, rich shades often hinted at wealth. Ordinary villagers usually wore softer, more practical colors: brown, gray, cream, muted green, the colors of wool, earth, bark, and fields. Rather fitting, really. The landscape quietly dressed the people who live within it. Winter accessories mattered just as much. Hoods protected ears from icy wind, cloaks wrapped around shoulders almost like portable blankets. Simple mittens helped keep fingers working long enough to finish outdoor chores. Imagine trying to milk a cow when your hands have decided they no longer wish to cooperate. Warm fingers become surprisingly important. Older people often dressed even more carefully. Age brought wisdom. It also brought joints that appreciated extra warmth. A grandmother who had survived 60 winters likely understood clothing better than anyone else in the village. If she suggested another layer, sensible people listened. Experience rarely argued loudly. It simply pointed toward the cloak hanging by the door. Clothing also reflected identity. Certain brooches fastened cloaks in recognizable regional styles. Decorated belt buckles hinted at craftsmanship. Embroidery appeared on finer garments. Even simple clothing could express pride, not vanity, just quiet satisfaction in work well done. A carefully woven cloak represented skill, patience, and family effort. It deserved appreciation. As afternoon faded into evening once more, villagers returned indoors carrying baskets, tools, and bundles of firewood. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. Boots left muddy prints near every doorway. Heavy cloaks were shaken free of frost before being hung close enough to the fire to dry, but not so close that a stray spark could ruin months of work. Another lesson learned through experience. The fire welcomed everyone home. Steam rose gently from damp wool. Children stretched tired legs toward the warmth. Someone stirred a pot hanging above glowing embers. Outside, winter continued exactly as winter always had. Cold, patient, unimpressed by human plans. Inside, however, layers of wool, careful craftsmanship, and generations of practical knowledge quietly held the cold at bay. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough. And sometimes in history, well enough was the greatest victory of all. If you asked someone in a Dark Age village who kept everything running during winter, they probably wouldn't point toward the local lord. They probably wouldn't mention a warrior, and they almost certainly wouldn't say the king. Instead, without making a grand speech about it, they would likely gesture toward the nearest house, because inside that smoky little building, women were quietly performing enough work to keep an entire household alive. History has a habit of celebrating dramatic people. The kings, the generals, the conquerors, the ones who insisted on giving themselves impressive nicknames. The great, the conqueror, the fearless. History was apparently very fond of confidence. Meanwhile, an ordinary woman who successfully managed food, clothing, children, livestock, medicine, and a household through 5 difficult winters rarely received so much as a paragraph. And yet, remove her from the story, the whole village begins to wobble. Let's spend a little time correcting that. Our morning begins before sunrise once again. The fire has burned low during the night. Not out, just resting beneath a blanket of ash. One careful poke with an iron rod reveals glowing embers still hiding underneath. Good. That means starting today's fire will be easier. Nobody wants to begin the morning by discovering that yesterday's precious fire has completely disappeared. Creating a new one from scratch is possible. Pleasant, however, is another matter entirely. So the first task often involves coaxing yesterday's warmth back to life. Dry straw, small twigs, thin pieces of birch, a few careful breaths. Then, a tiny orange flame appears, small enough to fit inside your hand, important enough to warm an entire family. There's something quietly beautiful about that. While the fire grows stronger, someone prepares breakfast. Nothing extravagant, perhaps oat porridge again. Nobody seems disappointed. Breakfast isn't expected to surprise anyone. Its purpose is simple. Provide enough energy to begin another day. That it does remarkably well. Water is added. The pot is stirred. Perhaps a pinch of salt. If fortune smiles, maybe a little butter. The smell slowly fills the house. Outside, the village is only just beginning to wake. A dog stretches. A rooster once again behaves, as though Dawn personally requested his assistance. Somewhere, another fire begins crackling. Soon, thin ribbons of smoke rise above every rooftop. One by one, the village comes back to life. Children also wake, not always enthusiastically. Some things truly never change. Little ones require washing, dressing, feeding, comforting, settling disagreements over whose wooden toy belongs to whom. Parenting has remained wonderfully familiar across the centuries. One child insists they are absolutely not tired. While yawning, another refuses breakfast until somebody else's breakfast suddenly looks much more interesting. History repeats itself in surprisingly ordinary ways. Once breakfast ends, the real work begins. Clothing must be checked. Has anyone torn a sleeve? Do the children still fit inside last winter's boots? Does father's cloak need another patch before tomorrow? Every answer leads naturally toward another task. Needles rarely remain idle. Spinning returns. The spindle twirls. Round and round. Hour after hour. It almost becomes part of the rhythm of the household. Conversation flows around it. Stories continue around it. Life quietly unfolds while thread slowly gathers. Modern people often struggle with doing only one thing at a time. Dark Age families became masters of doing several things gently together. Spinning while talking, watching children while cooking, repairing clothes while listening to stories. Efficiency wasn't rushed. It simply became habit. Let's float over to another surprisingly important responsibility. Managing food. Not cooking. Managing. There's a difference. Cooking lasts perhaps an hour. Managing food lasts all winter. Every sack of grain is quietly inspected. Every cheese carefully considered. Every smoked piece of meat represents future meals. Someone must remember exactly how much remains. Someone decides whether today deserves the last onions. Someone quietly wonders whether another barrel should remain unopened until February. Nobody writes these calculations into neat little spreadsheets. The numbers simply live inside experienced minds. Generation after generation, an elderly grandmother might know almost instinctively how long a family's food would last. Not because she studied mathematics, because she'd already survived 40 winters. Experience had become arithmetic. Her judgment carried enormous value. Children learned constantly, not inside classrooms, inside kitchens, beside spinning wheels, while gathering kindling. Watching adults remain their education. A little girl might learn how to recognize spoiled grain simply by watching her mother sort through a basket. A young boy might discover how much wood to place on the fire by observing his grandfather's careful hands. Nobody announced lessons. Knowledge quietly slipped from one generation into the next, like passing a loaf of bread across the table. Natural, expected, essential. Medicine also rested largely within household knowledge. Someone knew which herbs ease coughs. Someone remembered which leaves soothed cuts. Honey found its way onto wounds. Mint settled uneasy stomachs. Fennel helped digestion. Willow bark relieved pain. Many remedies genuinely worked. Others perhaps worked because people believed they would. The line between medicine and hope sometimes became wonderfully blurred. Winter illnesses remained common. Cold spread easily inside crowded homes. A cough traveled from one child to another with remarkable efficiency. Someone developed a fever. Another lost their appetite. Most recovered. Some did not. That uncertainty quietly accompanied every winter. No dramatic music. No grand speeches. Just worried families sitting beside beds, hoping tomorrow looked better. When someone became seriously ill, the entire household changed rhythm. Work still needed doing. Animals still required feeding. Meals still needed preparing. Life refused to pause simply because one person couldn't stand. Communities often helped where they could. A neighbor might bring food. Another might watch children. Another chopped extra firewood. Kindness frequently appeared in practical forms. Nobody asked whether helping was convenient. Sometimes necessity answered before the question finished. Women also managed relationships between households. Borrowing flour. Returning bowls. Sharing news. Checking on elderly neighbors. Arranging help when someone's roof needed repair. Villages weren't collections of isolated families. They functioned like woven cloth. Pull one thread too hard, and everything nearby felt the strain. Support traveled quietly through those invisible connections. One thing historians increasingly recognize is just how economically important women's work actually was. This wasn't helping. It was production. Thread became cloth. Milk became cheese. Grain became bread. Raw wool became clothing. Herbs became medicine. Children became capable adults. Every one of those transformations required labor, hours upon hours of skilled labor. Without it, villages simply couldn't function. It's rather remarkable how often traditional history overlooked this, perhaps because no one was conquering distant kingdoms while stirring porridge. Then again, conquering winter every single year seems like quite an achievement. Let's wander outside for a little while. The midday sun hangs low above frosty fields. Several women walk toward the stream carrying wooden buckets. The path is familiar. They've walked it countless times. Conversation flows naturally. Someone mentions a calf born early. Someone else worries about an elderly neighbor. Another laughs softly about a goose that somehow found its way inside the grain store yesterday. Geese, much like goats, appear to possess an impressive talent for creating administrative complications. The buckets return heavier than they left. Water splashes carefully over frozen ground. Nobody wants to slip. Broken bones are deeply inconvenient at the best of times. Winter rarely offers the best of times. By afternoon, children help wherever possible. They gather tiny sticks for kindling, carry messages between houses, watch younger siblings, practice simple tasks. Not because adults wish to end childhood quickly, because every useful skill strengthened the household. One day these children would manage homes of their own. Preparation began years in advance. As the evening settles once again, supper slowly cooks above the fire. The day's spinning is carefully wound into neat bundles. The repaired cloak is folded away. Fresh water waits in wooden buckets. The fire burns steadily. Outside, another cold night wraps itself around the village. Inside, generations sit together beneath one roof. Grandparents, parents, children, perhaps an unmarried aunt, perhaps a widowed uncle. Everyone contributing what they can. Nobody receiving applause. Nobody expecting it. And yet, as another winter day quietly comes to an end, it becomes increasingly clear that Britain's Dark Age villages survived not because of extraordinary moments, but because ordinary people performed extraordinary amounts of patient, unseen work. Day after day, winter after winter, year after year. Without them, there would have been no villages to defend, no kingdoms to build, no history left for us to tell. If you spent a winter in a Dark Age British village, you would quickly realize something that might surprise a modern visitor. The animals weren't somewhere out there on a distant farm. They were everywhere. You heard them before you saw them. A cow lowing just beyond the wall. A sheep complaining about something only another sheep could understand. A dog scratching at the door. Chickens wandering exactly where they weren't supposed to be. And somewhere, almost certainly, a goose making a sort of unnecessary noise that convinces you geese have been conducting personal feuds with humanity for thousands of years. People depended on animals so completely that it was impossible to separate village life from them. They provided food, clothing, leather, power for farming, protection, transportation, even companionship. In return, people spent an enormous part of every day caring for them. Winter made that relationship even more important. Let's begin with the cows. To a modern person, a cow might simply seem like a source of milk. To a Dark Age family, she was something much closer to an investment that quietly breathed. A healthy cow represented milk through much of the year. Milk became butter. Butter became cheese. Cheese became food months later, when fresh supplies had vanished. If the household owned an ox, life became easier in another way. Oxen pulled plows, dragged timber, moved heavy loads that no human could manage alone. Without them, farming demanded far more labor. A strong ox could quietly transform an entire family's future. No wonder people treated them with respect. Of course, oxen were not particularly fast. Nobody ever looked at an ox and thought, Now there's an animal built for speed. But they were patient, steady, reliable. History owes an astonishing amount to slow, dependable animals. Horses certainly existed. They attracted attention. Kings rode horses. Messengers rode horses. Warriors rode horses. Ordinary villagers, however, were far more likely to depend on oxen for heavy work. Practicality usually defeated glamour, as it often does. Winter created another challenge. Animals needed feeding precisely when fields stopped growing. Hay became precious. Throughout summer, people had cut grasses, dried them carefully, and stacked enormous herrits beside farms. Every forkful represented sunlight captured months earlier. It is rather poetic when you think about it. Summer quietly feeding winter. As the weeks passed, haystacks slowly shrank. Nobody ignored that. Each morning someone judged how much fodder could safely be given. Too little and animals weakened. Too much and supplies disappeared before spring. Again, life became a careful balancing act. Pigs occupied a rather different role. Unlike cows, many pigs did not remain alive throughout the winter. Late autumn traditionally became slaughtering season. That sounds grim, but it reflected practical reality. Keeping large numbers of pigs alive required food. Instead, families preserved pork by salting or smoking it. The meat lasted months. Fat became cooking grease. Skin became leather. Bones became tools. Nothing disappeared without purpose. Even today, archaeologists often find pig bones at settlement sites. Tiny reminders of thousands of ordinary meals. Still, a few pigs might remain, particularly breeding animals needed for future generations. They received careful attention. Healthy pigs meant future food. Simple enough. Now let's drift over to one of history's least appreciated employees, the village chicken. Chickens possessed remarkable efficiency. They turned scraps into eggs, occasionally into meat. They required relatively little space. Children could help care for them. Everybody benefited. Their only obvious weakness involved wandering absolutely everywhere. If you left the door open, there was always a reasonable chance a chicken would decide your house looked interesting. Perhaps there was food. Perhaps simple curiosity. Perhaps chickens have always believed that every doorway deserves inspection. No one really knows. Egg production naturally slowed during winter because daylight decreased. Modern farms saw that problem with electric lighting. Dark Age Britain relied upon the sun. When daylight shortened, chickens quietly adjusted their schedules. Nature remained in charge. Families accepted fewer eggs without much complaint. Complaining to hens rarely improved productivity. Dogs probably held the most varied jobs in the village. They guarded homes, watched livestock, accompanied hunters, warned families about strangers approaching. Children undoubtedly played with them whenever work allowed. A good dog became almost another member of the household, not spoiled in the modern sense. Nobody purchased luxury beds embroidered with tiny crowns, but respected, fed, trusted. A dependable dog earned affection through usefulness. Cats performed an equally important duty, though with rather less enthusiasm for taking instructions. Grain stores attracted mice. Mice attracted cats. Everyone understood the arrangement. A hard-working cat protected months of precious food from disappearing one nibble at a time. One imagines the cats viewed the situation rather differently. They keep putting delicious little animals inside this building. How thoughtful. Motivations rarely need to match for cooperation to succeed. Sheep deserve another visit, not only because of their wool. Their meat provided food. Their milk occasionally contributed to cheese making. Their skins became warm clothing. Their manure fertilized fields. Very little about a sheep when used. Yet sheep themselves remain wonderfully uncomplicated creatures. Eat grass. Follow other sheep. Occasionally become convinced that standing in the exact wrong place is somehow an excellent decision. Fortunately, shepherds possess remarkable patience. They needed it. Goats added another layer of personality to village life. If sheep were calm neighbors, goats were energetic troublemakers. They climbed fences, sampled gardens, examined laundry, investigated absolutely everything. One suspect's villages forgave them simply because goats supplied valuable milk. Besides, someone had to provide comic relief during long winters. Goats accepted the responsibility with admirable dedication. Animals also generated warmth. This explains why many farms kept livestock surprisingly close to living spaces. Modern people often react with understandable hesitation. Surely that must have smelled rather agricultural? Yes, probably. But warmth mattered. Shared walls trapped heat. Buildings became more efficient. Comfort sometimes required practical compromises. People living at the time likely noticed the warmth far more than the smell. Perspective changes everything. Let's wander outside with one of the villagers as evening approaches. Snow crunches gently beneath leather shoes. The air feels wonderfully sharp. Before anyone can settle beside the fire, the animals must be checked. The stable door is inspected. Water troughs examined. Extra hay distributed. Nothing dramatic. Just another quiet routine repeated countless times. The cow receives fresh bedding. The horse is brushed. The sheep are counted. Again, just to be certain. Nobody wishes to explain tomorrow morning why one sheep has somehow vanished overnight. Predators still existed. Wolves had not completely disappeared from Britain. Foxes certainly remained common. Most attacks were probably rare near busy villages. Even so, sensible people preferred caution. Strong fences, watchful dogs, secure buildings. Preparation usually proved easier than regret. Winter storms occasionally frightened livestock. High winds rattled wooden walls. Heavy snow muffled familiar sounds. Animals sometimes became restless. Experienced farmers noticed these changes immediately. A calm voice, a reassuring touch, fresh bedding. Simple actions often settled nervous creatures. People understood animal behavior through daily observation rather than scientific textbooks. Experience remained the greatest teacher. Children learned this naturally. A boy helping his father feed sheep gradually recognized healthy behavior. A girl milking cows noticed subtle changes in temperament. Knowledge accumulated quietly, not during lectures, but through years of ordinary mornings. That kind of education rarely appears in history books, yet it built entire societies. Even birds overhead played their part. Crows and ravens cleaned carrion from fields. Owls hunted mice after dark. Wild ducks visited rivers during migration. The natural world constantly interacted with village life. People watched it carefully, not out of idle curiosity, because understanding nature improved survival. A sudden flock of birds might hint at changing weather. Animal behavior sometimes warned of approaching storms, perhaps not perfectly, but often well enough. As darkness slowly settles across the countryside once more, the village grows peaceful. The animals have been fed, doors secured, water buckets filled, the last chores quietly completed. Inside each house, families gather once again around glowing fires. Outside, the stable grows still. A horse shifts gently in the straw. A cow settles onto fresh bedding. Somewhere beyond the fields, an owl glides silently through frosty air. Human lives and animal lives rest side by side, not separate worlds. One shared world, each depending upon the other. And in the deep winters of Dark Age Britain, that partnership may have been one of the greatest reasons spring always found people waiting to welcome it. There was one knock on the door that nobody particularly wanted to hear during the middle of winter, not because visitors weren't welcome. Visitors often brought news, conversation, and a pleasant excuse to keep the fire burning a little longer. No, this was a different sort of knock, a quiet one, usually after sunset. Someone standing outside with their cloak pulled tightly around them. Someone saying a few simple words. Could you come? Nothing more needed to be explained. Someone was ill, and in a Dark Age village, illness never concerned only one person. It quietly involved everyone. Let's imagine one such evening. Snow has begun falling again. Not dramatically. Just a gentle, patient sort of snowfall that slowly softens every sound. Inside the house, supper is almost ready. The barley stew has been simmering since afternoon. Children have finally settled down after debating whether a wooden carving represents a horse, a cow, or, according to one particularly imaginative child, a dragon. Parents wisely decide not to settle the argument. Some mysteries are worth preserving. Then comes a knock. The visitor removes their hood. A worried expression says almost everything before the first words leave their mouth. Old Edwin has taken a fever. Immediately the rhythm of the evening changes. Nobody panics. Panic wastes energy. Instead, people move with quiet purpose. A small pouch of dried herbs is collected. A beeswax candle, if one could be spared. Perhaps a little honey. A clean cloth. Simple things. Very simple things. Yet often the best anyone had. The village healer was rarely someone with an official title. No framed certificate hung proudly on the wall. No impressive list of qualifications written in elegant Latin. Instead, they were simply the person everyone trusted. Usually older, usually experienced. Someone who had spent decades watching what worked and what didn't. Knowledge had accumulated one winter at a time. Some of that knowledge came from Christian monasteries. Some came from older local traditions passed through generations. Some came from pure observation. If a certain herb seemed to ease a cough often enough, people remembered. If another plant consistently upset everyone's stomach, well, that lesson also spread rather quickly. Experience can be an exceptionally persuasive teacher. Herbs played a surprisingly important role in everyday medicine. Mint soothed digestion. Sage eased sore throats. Yarrow helped stop bleeding. Comfrey was often used on bruises and broken bones, though modern medicine now advises caution with internal use. Willow bark eased pain. Long before chemists isolated aspirin, people had already discovered that certain tree bark seemed remarkably helpful, not because they understood the chemistry, because generations of careful observation had quietly reached the correct conclusion. Nature occasionally rewarded patience. Honey remained one of the most valuable medicines available. Today we drizzle it into tea. Back then it carried far greater importance. Its natural antibacterial qualities helped wounds heal. It soothed sore throats. It preserved certain preparations. A small pot of honey represented both food and medicine. Quite an impressive resume for something produced by insects. One almost wants to thank the bees personally. The healer arrives at Edwin's house. The room feels warmer than outside, but only just. His family waits anxiously. Someone has already placed extra blankets around him. His breathing sounds heavy. His forehead feels hot. The healer kneels quietly beside the bed. No dramatic speeches. No miraculous promises. Just careful observation. The pulse. The breathing. The skin. The eyes. Experience notices details younger people often miss. A drink containing herbs is prepared. Cool water is offered. The family receives simple instructions. Keep him warm. Encourage him to drink. Watch his breathing. Return if things worsen. Modern hospitals rely upon monitors that beep gently through the night. Dark Age villages relied upon worried relatives doing exactly the same thing with their own eyes. Watching. Waiting. Hoping. Prayer naturally accompanied treatment. Christian faith shaped everyday life throughout much of Britain by this period. Families prayed together. The village priest might visit. Psalms were recited. Crosses were traced. Healing belonged both to practical care and spiritual comfort. To people living then, these things were not separate. One supported the other. Older beliefs sometimes lingered alongside Christianity. Certain charms survived. Ancient traditions mixed quietly with newer religious practices. History rarely changes overnight. It usually layers one belief gently upon another. The result becomes wonderfully human, and occasionally rather complicated. Children, fortunately, recover from many ordinary illnesses surprisingly well. They also caught them with impressive enthusiasm. A sniffle spread through the household, then another. Soon everyone seemed to be coughing politely into their sleeves. Winter encouraged these little epidemics. Families lived close together. Warmth required shared space. Shared space encouraged shared germs. Nobody knew about bacteria or viruses. They only knew that illness often visited several houses in succession. Patterns existed long before explanations. Accidents remained another concern. A slip on frozen ground. A cut while splitting firewood. A burn from the cooking fire. Most healed. Some became infected. Infection frightened people. Rightly so. without antibiotics. Even small wounds deserve careful attention. Clean water, honey, herbs, bandages made from clean linen, hope. Sometimes that combination proved enough. Sometimes it did not. Pregnancy added another layer of uncertainty. Winter births certainly happened. Babies rarely consulted calendars before arriving. Midwives became among the most respected women in the community. They carried practical knowledge earned through years of experience. Every successful birth strengthened the village's future. Every difficult one reminded everyone how fragile life remained. Yet children continued arriving. Families continued growing. Life quietly insisted upon continuing. Even elderly villagers contributed enormously. Perhaps they no longer carried heavy logs. Perhaps they no longer walked long distances. But they remembered which herbs flowered first in spring, how to repair old weaving patterns, which fields flooded after unusually wet winters. Memory itself became valuable work. Age transformed experience into guidance. Modern societies sometimes celebrate speed. Dark Age villages often celebrated memory. The monastery, if one stood nearby, represented another source of healing. Monks copied medical texts by hand. They cultivated herb gardens. They offered hospitality to travelers. They prayed for the sick. Many monasteries became small centers of learning in a world where books remained astonishingly rare. Imagine spending months copying one manuscript, every letter formed carefully, every mistake corrected patiently, cold fingers gripping a goose feather quill while daylight slowly faded. Knowledge survived because someone refused to stop writing. There is something quietly heroic about that. Let's drift back to Edwin. Several days have passed. His fever begins to break. He asks for food. Not much, just a little broth. His family smiles for the first time in days. Recovery rarely arrived dramatically. People simply noticed tiny improvements. One spoonful, then two. A little more conversation, a little stronger voice. Life slowly returning through ordinary moments. The healer leaves with a nod. No celebration. No expectation of payment beyond what the family can reasonably spare. Perhaps a loaf of bread later. Perhaps some cheese. Perhaps help repairing a fence come spring. Communities remembered kindness. Eventually, someone always returned the favor. Not every story ended so gently. Winter claimed lives, especially among the very young and the very old. Villagers understood this with heartbreaking familiarity. Funerals took place. Prayers were said. Work continued. Not because people cared less. Because the animals still needed feeding. Children still needed breakfast. The fire still needed tending. Grief walked beside daily life rather than replacing it. Perhaps that is one of the quietest lessons history offers. People carried sorrow and still baked bread, still mended clothes, still gathered firewood, still laughed occasionally when a goose chased someone across the yard for reasons known only to the goose. Life rarely paused completely. As another evening settles over our village, Edwin sleeps peacefully. His breathing has steadied. Outside, snowflakes drift silently through the darkness. Inside, someone stirs a fire. Someone folds clean linen. Someone whispers a final prayer before sleep. The village grows quiet once again. Tomorrow will bring new work, new worries, new small victories, and with a little luck, one more day closer to spring. While most people in Dark Age Britain spent the winter worrying about firewood, hungry livestock, and whether the barley would last until spring, there was another group of people living a life that looked both familiar and completely different. They also woke before dawn. They also felt the cold. They also lived with smoky fires and damp weather. But instead of beginning the morning by feeding pigs or repairing fences, they began with prayer. Welcome to the monastery, not the enormous stone abbeys that many people picture today. Those belonged largely to later centuries. Many early monasteries were surprisingly modest. Clusters of timber buildings, simple churches, small workshops, gardens sleeping beneath winter frost, a guest house for travelers, perhaps a tiny library that represented one of the greatest collections of knowledge for many miles. From the outside, it looked peaceful. Inside, it was remarkably busy. Monks followed routines so regular that even the village rooster might have admired the dedication. before sunrise, while most of Britain still slept beneath thick wool blankets, bells, or sometimes simply another monk's voice called a community together. The church remained dark except for candles. Breath drifted visibly through the cold air. Yes, even inside, stone buildings had many advantages. Remaining warm was not always among them. Imagine trying to sing morning prayers while your fingers quietly wondered whether they still belonged to you. The monks somehow managed. After prayers came work. That work varied enormously. Some brothers cared for livestock. Others cooked. Some tended the gardens whenever the season allowed. Others repaired buildings. One might supervise brewing ale. Another looked after guests. Contrary to popular imagination, monasteries were not places where everyone simply sat reading books all day. Books certainly mattered, but so did chopping wood. Someone always had to chop the wood. History repeatedly reminds us that no amount of scholarship can convince a freezing fireplace to produce heat by itself. Perhaps the most famous room in many monasteries was the scriptorium, the writing room. If there was one place where patience became an art form, this was it. Picture a long wooden table positioned near the best available light. Not perfect light, just the best they had. A monk sits quietly with sheets of parchment in front of him. Beside him rests a small knife for trimming quills. Tiny containers of ink. A feather carefully shaped into a pen. And, perhaps most importantly, the manuscript he has been copying for weeks. Or months. Every single letter must be copied carefully. Every word checked. Every line kept neat. There is no undo button. There is certainly no spell check. If you make a mistake halfway through a valuable parchment page, well, you become unexpectedly creative about correcting it. The pages themselves were expensive. Parchment came from animal skins. Producing it required skill and time. Nothing could be wasted. A careless ink blot wasn't merely annoying. It represented real loss. Monks learned remarkable discipline. The handwriting found in surviving manuscripts still impresses historians today. Straight lines, beautiful lettering, decorated capitals, tiny illustrations filled with birds, vines, fantastic animals, and curious little faces peeking from the margins. One occasionally suspects the artist became just slightly bored after writing the same style of letters for several hundred pages. A cheerful rabbit with a trumpet suddenly seems entirely reasonable. Long hours encourage creativity. The cold added another challenge. Ink behaved differently in winter. Hands stiffened. Candles burned low. Daylight disappeared early. Imagine carefully painting tiny golden details onto a page while your fingers slowly forgot what warmth felt like. It required extraordinary concentration. The finished books justified the effort. Books were treasures, not in the poetic sense. In the literal one, a single manuscript might represent months or even years of labor. Some monasteries owned only a modest collection, yet those shelves contained theology, history, poetry, medicine, Latin grammar, biblical commentaries, classical Roman authors, knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared. It's one of history's quieter miracles. While kingdoms rose and fell outside, someone inside a chilly room kept copying another page, then another, because of those quiet efforts. Countless ancient texts survived long enough for later generations to rediscover them. Without those patient scribes, our understanding of the ancient world would be dramatically poorer. Monasteries also welcomed travelers. Imagine walking for days through winter rain. Your boots are soaked. Your stomach complains loudly. The wind seems personally offended by your existence. Then, just before sunset, you reach a monastery, a fire, warm food, a dry place to sleep. It probably felt almost miraculous. Hospitality formed an important part of monastic life. Guests were received kindly whenever possible, not because supplies were endless, far from it, but because charity stood at the heart of their beliefs. The guest house became a place where stories traveled. A merchant described distant markets. A pilgrim spoke about another monastery. A messenger carried news from a nearby kingdom. Ideas move alongside people, sometimes slowly, but they moved. For villages nearby, monasteries often served as centers of learning. A local family might ask a monk to write an important document. Someone might seek advice about a boundary dispute. Children destined for church life sometimes received instruction there. Very few ordinary villagers learned to read. Books remained rare. Education required time that most farming families simply couldn't spare. When every pair of hands helped secure the harvest, spending years studying grammar became a remarkable luxury. Still, knowledge spread in smaller ways. Monks preached sermons, shared practical advice, taught prayers, recommended medicinal herbs, copied letters for those unable to write. Learning did not remain trapped inside monastery walls. It slowly flowed outward. The monastery kitchen looked surprisingly familiar. Large pots simmered over open fires. Bread baked in ovens. Ale was brewed. Yes, ale. Water was not always the safest drink, particularly where supplies became contaminated. Weak ale often formed part of everyday meals because the brewing process involved boiling water. Children drank it too, though generally much weaker than anything served in a modern pub. History occasionally surprises us. Monastic meals reflected simplicity. Bread, vegetables, beans, fish when available, cheese, occasionally eggs. Many religious communities avoided eating meat on numerous days throughout the year. Rules varied. Discipline mattered. The purpose wasn't comfort. It was devotion. Even so, one imagines everyone looked forward to feast days when the menu became just a little more generous. Gardens surrounded many monasteries. During winter, they rested beneath frost. But even now, monks planned for spring. Seeds were checked, tools repaired, fruit trees pruned when appropriate, herb beds prepared for warmer weather. Much like farmers, they understood that next season depended upon today's quiet preparation. Time moved in circles, not straight lines. One season naturally led into another. Monasteries also rang with music, not instruments most of the time. Human voices. Chant echoed through wooden churches and stone chapels alike. Simple melodies rose gently into cold morning air. There is something wonderfully peaceful about imagining those sounds drifting across snowy fields while a nearby village slowly wakes. Somewhere a farmer feeds his ox. Somewhere a monk finishes morning prayers. Different lives. The same winter. Not every monk had entered the monastery as a child. Some arrived after military service. Others after losing family members. Some sought education. Others sought quiet. Each brought memories from the outside world. Those memories enriched the community. Conversations during winter evenings likely wandered across countless subjects. Scripture, harvests, Roman ruins, kings, saints, the weather. British weather has always provided reliable conversation. It asks remarkably little effort from anyone involved. As darkness settles once again, candles flicker across the scriptorium. One final page is completed. The quill is carefully cleaned. The ink covered. The precious manuscript wrapped safely away until tomorrow. Outside, frost slowly spreads across the monastery gardens. Inside, another brother quietly places another log onto fire, not because he expects recognition, simply because everyone else will need warmth before dawn. And perhaps that small act captures the monastery better than anything else. A place where knowledge, prayer, work, and ordinary kindness quietly live together through even the coldest winters. While the rest of Britain slept beneath smoky roofs, the monks patiently preserved words that would outlive kingdoms. One careful letter at a time. After many weeks of winter, even the smallest change would feel surprisingly exciting. A different voice, a stranger's face, a horse pulling a cart along the frozen road. For people living in a dark age British village, these moments didn't happen every day. Most winters settled into a comforting rhythm of familiar faces, familiar chores, and familiar conversations. You knew who would be tending the sheep. You knew who would arrive at the stream each morning with wooden buckets. You knew exactly which neighbor's rooster believed sunrise was impossible without his enthusiastic participation. Life felt wonderfully predictable. Then one afternoon, someone appeared from the road. Not an army, not a noble procession, just a traveler, perhaps a merchant, perhaps a wandering craftsman. perhaps a pilgrim making the slow journey between monasteries. Immediately, the village became just a little more interesting. Nobody rushed dramatically into the street. This is still Britain in the Dark Ages, not the opening scene of an adventure film. People simply noticed. Heads turned. A few doors opened. Dogs barked with professional dedication. Children quietly wandered closer while pretending not to be curious. Adults did exactly the same thing, just with considerably more dignity. Travel during winter was difficult enough that most people avoided it unless they had good reason. Roads were muddy. River crossings became dangerous. Snow covered familiar landmarks. Cold rain soaked clothing within hours. Even experienced travelers respected the season. So, if someone arrived despite all of that, they usually had a purpose. The visitor might carry a small pack filled with useful goods. Nothing extravagant. Perhaps a handful of iron nails, a new knife, a polished whetstone, salt gathered from distant coasts, a few pieces of fine cloth, maybe tiny glass beads that sparkled beautifully in firelight. To modern eyes, these might seem ordinary. To villagers who rarely encounter new objects, they could appear wonderfully exotic. Imagine seeing bright blue glass for the first time in months. It would catch every flicker of the fire. Children would almost certainly stare. Adults probably would too, although they would pretend they were merely inspecting the craftsmanship. Merchants themselves led demanding lives. There were no comfortable inns every few miles. No weather forecast warning about tomorrow's snow. No neatly paved highways stretching across the countryside. Instead, they relied on memory, local knowledge, and more than a little optimism. Many followed routes that had existed for generations. Some roads still traced the paths built by the Romans centuries earlier. Others were little more than muddy tracks, connecting one settlement to another. A traveler learned quickly which bridges could be trusted, which rivers rose after heavy rain, which villages welcomed strangers, and which villages preferred several careful questions before opening the gate. That caution made sense. Most strangers were harmless. A few were not. Communities depended upon good judgment. Hospitality and caution walked side by side. A guest might receive warm food and a place beside the fire. At the same time, everyone quietly noticed where he came from, where he was going, and whether his story remained consistent. People had become excellent judges of character long before official passports existed. Conversation formed the real treasure. Goods mattered. News mattered even more. The traveler might casually mention that a monastery 2 days away had completed a new church. Someone else heard that a local king had settled a dispute. Another village experienced a poor harvest. A bridge had collapsed. Wolves had been seen farther north. A wandering storyteller had arrived somewhere beyond the hills. Information drifted across Britain one conversation at a time. Nobody expected breaking news. Instead, events slowly spread like ripples across a pond. By the time distant happenings reached a small farming village, they often sounded almost legendary. Sometimes the stories grew slightly larger during the journey. Quite naturally, a group of 10 travelers quietly became 20. A heavy snowfall transformed into the worst winter anyone had ever witnessed. An unusually large boar gradually evolved into something that sounded suspiciously capable of arguing with people. Storytelling has always possessed a healthy imagination. The village blacksmith often became one of the first people a traveler visited. Iron wore out, axes dulled, knives chipped, horses occasionally needed shoes. If a merchant carried quality iron, the blacksmith paid close attention. Good metal remained valuable everywhere. Poor metal became obvious surprisingly quickly. A cracked blade inspired very little confidence. Craftsmanship earned reputation. Reputation earned business. Simple enough. Markets themselves were not daily affairs in most rural areas. Instead, larger settlements held market days where surrounding communities gathered. Reaching one during winter required determination. Imagine setting out before dawn with a sack of wool over one shoulder and a basket of cheese balanced carefully beside you. The road disappears beneath thick mud after the first mile. Cold rain arrives shortly afterward. By the time you finally reach the market, your boots have developed an intimate relationship with wet clay. Still, The journey remained worthwhile. Markets offered things unavailable at home. Not only goods, people. You met relatives, neighbors from distant villages, monks purchasing supplies, craftsmen seeking customers, sometimes entertainers, perhaps a musician carrying a small harp, perhaps a storyteller who knew legends from kingdoms far away. Children likely remembered those visits for weeks afterward. For adults, markets represented opportunities to compare harvests, exchange ideas, arrange marriages, settle debts, and strengthen friendships. Trade was about much more than buying and selling. It connected communities. Coins certainly circulated, especially silver pennies. Yet, barter remained common. A wheel of cheese might purchase a repair tool. What could be exchanged for salt? A day's labor might repay a favor. Money simplified trade. Trust sustained it. If everyone knew you always honored agreements, people welcomed doing business with you. If you developed the opposite reputation, well, villages were small. People remembered, quite vividly. Winter also encouraged another kind of visitor, the wandering craftsman, perhaps a carpenter. Ideas rarely stayed still for long. Even recipes wandered. A woman visiting relatives might discover a slightly different way of preserving apples. Another family seasoned their stew with unfamiliar herbs. Some village baked flatter bread. Another preferred thicker loaves. Little improvement spread naturally through conversation. Nobody announced they were launching an innovation strategy. Someone simply said, "Have you ever tried doing it this way?" Sometimes the answer changed daily life. Not every traveler remained welcome. Bandits certainly existed. So did thieves. Most roads were peaceful most of the time, but sensible people prepared for unpleasant possibilities. Traveling together improved safety. Merchants often joined small groups. Monasteries provided shelter. Villages closed gates after dark where such defenses existed. Preparation remained preferable to regret. As afternoon slowly fades, our traveler prepares to continue his journey. The horse receives fresh water. A little bread is packed away. Perhaps someone quietly slips an extra piece of cheese into his bag. Not because they expect repayment, simply because winter roads are long. The villagers gather briefly to say farewell. Children wave enthusiastically. The dogs remain unconvinced about the entire arrangement. The traveler disappears slowly beyond the frosty trees. His footprints gradually vanish beneath fresh snow. Yet something remains behind. Not an object, a conversation. A story about another village. News of a distant monastery. A rumor about a king. A glimpse of a world larger than the fields surrounding home. For another few weeks, those stories will be shared beside evening fires. Expanded just a little. Remembered fondly. Then winter settles comfortably back into its familiar rhythm. The village becomes quiet once more. Smoke rises from the roofs. The animals settle into their stalls. The fire crackles gently. And somewhere, many miles away, that same traveler is probably arriving at another little village, carrying another handful of goods. After listening to all this talk about smoky houses, frozen fields, damp boots, and endless bowls of barley porridge, you might begin to wonder something. Did people in Dark Age Britain ever actually enjoy winter? The answer is yes, just perhaps not in the way we usually imagine. Their happiness rarely arrived through grand celebrations with endless food piled across enormous tables. For most ordinary families, there simply wasn't enough spare food for that. Instead, joy appeared in smaller ways. A successful harvest remembered, a healthy newborn calf, a neighbor recovering from illness, a clear day after a week of rain, a loaf of bread that turned out particularly well. History often hides happiness because happiness doesn't usually leave impressive ruins behind. Nobody excavates an archaeological site and discovers, evidence of everyone having a rather pleasant Tuesday. Instead, we have to look more carefully. The first thing to understand is that winter wasn't one long season of sadness. It contained moments of celebration. The Christian calendar had become an important part of life across much of Britain. Major feast days gave people reasons to gather, pray, share food, and briefly step away from the endless rhythm of everyday work. Christmas was already celebrated, although it looked rather different from the holiday many of us know today. There were no sparkling trees covered in electric lights, no mountains of wrapped presents, no cheerful songs playing in every marketplace for 6 weeks beforehand. One suspects many villagers would have considered that last idea slightly exhausting. Instead, the celebration centered around church, shared meals, and the comforting reminder that even during the darkest part of the year, light still carried meaning. The winter solstice also lingered in people's awareness. Long before Christianity reached Britain, communities had watched the shortest day with careful attention. After all, if your life depended upon the seasons, the gradual return of daylight mattered enormously. Even after religious traditions changed, people still noticed the sky. The sun slowly began staying above the horizon a little longer each afternoon. Not enough to transform daily life immediately, but enough to encourage quiet optimism. Nature itself whispered, "We're heading in the right direction." That alone felt worth celebrating. Let's imagine one of these feast days. Our village wakes beneath a pale winter sunrise. The chores still happen. The cows remain entirely uninterested in religious holidays. They expect breakfast exactly as usual. The sheep continue behaving like sheep. The fire still needs tending. Life doesn't stop, but it slows. Just enough. People wear their best clothing, not necessarily luxurious. Simply the nicest garments they own. Perhaps the cloak fastened with the family's finest brooch. Perhaps a carefully embroidered cuff that only appears on special occasions. A tunic patched many times can still be worn proudly if it has been lovingly cared for. Children notice the difference immediately. Special clothes usually suggest a special day. The church gradually fills. Candles flicker softly against timber walls. Neighbors greet one another. Voices remain gentle. The priest begins the service. Prayers rise together. Outside, frost sparkles across the fields. Inside, warmth comes less from the building and more from the people gathered together. Afterward, families return home. Now comes the meal. Not extravagant, just better. Perhaps a little extra cheese. A larger loaf of bread. A piece of smoked pork saved carefully for weeks. Maybe honey stirred into oat cakes. Perhaps apples preserved from autumn. Simple improvements. Yet after months of careful rationing, they feel wonderfully generous. It is remarkable how quickly gratitude grows when abundance is rare. Children probably enjoy these days more than anyone. There is better food, more laughter, fewer ordinary chores. Adults linger over conversations instead of rushing back to work. Stories stretch longer into the evening. Even the fire seems warmer somehow. Memory has a habit of improving familiar places. Music sometimes joins the celebration. Not grand orchestras. Nothing remotely like that. Perhaps someone carried a small harp. Someone else played a simple pipe made from wood or bone. Voices joined together in songs remembered across generations. Many melodies have disappeared forever. That feels strangely sad. Imagine all the songs that once echoed through winter evenings, now completely silent. History preserves many remarkable things. Music often slips gently through its fingers. Dancing almost certainly happened too. Not every feast, not every village. But human beings have always found reasons to move when spirits are high. After listening to all this talk about smoky houses, frozen fields, damp boots, and endless bowls of barley porridge, you might begin to wonder something. Did people in Dark Age Britain ever actually enjoy winter? The answer is yes, just perhaps not in the way we usually imagine. Their happiness rarely arrived through grand celebrations with endless food piled across enormous tables. For most ordinary families, there simply wasn't enough spare food for that. Instead, joy appeared in smaller ways. A successful harvest remembered, a healthy newborn calf, a neighbor recovering from illness, a clear day after a week of rain, a loaf of bread that turned out particularly well. History often hides happiness because happiness doesn't usually leave impressive ruins behind. Nobody excavates an archaeological site and discovers, evidence of everyone having a rather pleasant Tuesday. Instead, we have to look more carefully. The first thing to understand is that winter wasn't one long season of sadness. It contained moments of celebration. The Christian calendar had become an important part of life across much of Britain. Major feast days gave people reasons to gather, pray, share food, and briefly step away from the endless rhythm of everyday work. Christmas was already celebrated, although it looked rather different from the holiday many of us know today. There were no sparkling trees covered in electric lights, no mountains of wrapped presents, no cheerful songs playing in every marketplace for 6 weeks beforehand. One suspects many villagers would have considered that last idea slightly exhausting. Instead, the celebration centered around church, shared meals, and the comforting reminder that even during the darkest part of the year, light still carried meaning. The winter solstice also lingered in people's awareness. Long before Christianity reached Britain, communities had watched the shortest day with careful attention. After all, if your life depended upon the seasons, the gradual return of daylight mattered enormously. Even after religious traditions changed, people still noticed the sky. The sun slowly began staying above the horizon a little longer each afternoon. Not enough to transform daily life immediately, but enough to encourage quiet optimism. Nature itself whispered, "We're heading in the right direction." That alone felt worth celebrating. Let's imagine one of these feast days. Our village wakes beneath a pale winter sunrise. The chores still happen. The cows remain entirely uninterested in religious holidays. They expect breakfast exactly as usual. The sheep continue behaving like sheep. The fire still needs tending. Life doesn't stop, but it slows. Just enough. People wear their best clothing. Not necessarily luxurious. Simply the nicest garments they own. Perhaps the cloak fastened with the family's finest brooch. Perhaps a carefully embroidered cuff that only appears on special occasions. A tunic patched many times can still be worn proudly if it has been lovingly cared for. Children notice the difference immediately. Special clothes usually suggest a special day. The church gradually fills. Candles flicker softly against timber walls. Neighbors greet one another. Voices remain gentle. The priest begins the service. Prayers rise together. Outside, frost sparkles across the fields. Inside, warmth comes less from the building and more from the people gathered together. Afterward, families return home. Now comes a meal, not extravagant, just better. Perhaps a little extra cheese, a larger loaf of bread, a piece of smoked pork saved carefully for weeks. Maybe honey stirred into oat cakes. Perhaps apples preserved from autumn. Simple improvements. Yet after months of careful rationing, they feel wonderfully generous. It is remarkable how quickly gratitude grows when abundance is rare. Children probably enjoy these days more than anyone. There is better food, more laughter, fewer ordinary chores. Adults linger over conversations instead of rushing back to work. Stories stretch longer into the evening. Even the fire seems warmer somehow. Memory has a habit of improving familiar places. Music sometimes joins the celebration. Not grand orchestras. Nothing remotely like that. Perhaps someone carried a small harp. Someone else played a simple pipe made from wood or bone. Voices joined together in songs remembered across generations. Many melodies have disappeared forever. That feels strangely sad. Imagine all the songs that once echoed through winter evenings, now completely silent. History preserves many remarkable things. Music often slips gently through its fingers. Dancing almost certainly happened too. Not every feast, not every village. But human beings have always found reasons to move when spirits are high. If you have stayed beside our little village through these long winter months, first of all, thank you. We watched the smoke curl above thatched roofs. We followed families through icy mornings, quiet evenings, careful meals, and countless ordinary moments that history books rarely pause to notice. And now, almost without anyone realizing exactly when it happened, something begins to change. Not dramatically. Spring never bursts through the door announcing itself. It simply starts leaving tiny clues. One here, another there, a little earlier sunrise, a little softer breeze, a bird whose song hasn't been heard for months. At first, almost nobody mentions it. Winter has fooled people before. One warm afternoon means very little. Britain has always enjoyed reminding everyone that weather should never become overconfident. A pleasant Tuesday can easily become a freezing Thursday. Experience teaches caution. Hope is welcome. Certainty is another matter. Our village wakes before dawn, as it always has. The fire is stirred. The porridge simmers. The animals wait impatiently for breakfast. Yet outside, the darkness doesn't last quite as long as it did a few weeks ago. It is only a few extra minutes. Enough that someone notices while carrying water. Enough that an old grandfather quietly smiles to himself. He has seen this happen more than 60 times. He knows what it means. Nobody celebrates yet, but everyone remembers. The fields still appear brown and tired. Patches of frost linger beneath hedges. The trees remain mostly bare. Then, one afternoon, someone finds the first tiny green shoots pushing carefully through the cold earth. Not many, just a handful. Delicate, almost fragile. It is remarkable how much hope can fit inside one small green leaf. Children usually spot these changes first, not because they understand farming better than adults. Quite the opposite, because children spend more time looking closely at the ground, searching for interesting stones, following beetles, poking sticks into puddles, examining absolutely everything. Adults, meanwhile, often hurry toward the next chore. Children wander. History quietly benefits from wandering. Soon another sign appears. Birdsong. For months the mornings have been peaceful, almost silent. Now a robin sings from a nearby hedge. Another bird answers from an oak tree. The village seems just a little less quiet. Not noisy. Simply awake. The animals notice the season changing too. The sheep grow more restless. The chickens begin laying more eggs as daylight slowly increases. The village dog spends longer wandering outside before deciding it might finally be time for a nap beside the fire. Even the old farm cat appears slightly more interested in exploring the yard. Although, being a cat, it naturally behaves as though this had been its brilliant idea all along. The food stores, however, are reaching their most worrying point. This surprises many people learning about medieval life. The end of winter could actually be harder than the beginning. Back in autumn, the grain bins had been full. The smoked meat hung thick beneath the rafters. Cheese filled the storage chests. Now, every barrel feels lighter, every sack emptier. Families know exactly how much remains. The final weeks before new crops begin growing have a name among historians. Sometimes they are called the Hungry Gap, not because people were always starving. Many were not, but because supplies had reached their lowest point while fresh food had not yet arrived. It was a season balanced delicately between patience and necessity. Nobody wasted anything now. The last onions, the final smoked ham, the smallest piece of hard cheese. Everything still mattered. Yet alongside those shrinking supplies came growing confidence. Soon the fields would belong to them once again. The earth had rested long enough. Tools began appearing outdoors more frequently. Axes were sharpened, wooden plows inspected, iron blades cleaned carefully. Winter repairs had prepared everything for this moment. All those evenings spent mending broken handles beside the fire suddenly revealed their purpose. Nothing had been wasted. Even children sensed that something exciting approached. They spent longer outside. The muddy lanes, impossible only weeks earlier, slowly became easier to walk. Streams flowed faster as melting frost released fresh water into the countryside. Tiny flowers appeared beneath hedgerows, white snowdrops, then bright yellow celandines. Small miracles that required no applause. Simply sunlight. The village itself seemed to breathe differently. Doors remained open a little longer each afternoon. People paused outside to talk rather than immediately hurrying indoors. Cloaks were still worn, but sometimes, just sometimes, someone loosened the clasp because the afternoon had become pleasantly mild. That tiny gesture would have seemed almost unbelievable during the deepest days of January. The smoke above the rooftops still drifted upward. The fire still burned, but they no longer fought quite so fiercely against the cold. Instead, they simply welcomed people home after another busy day. Let's take a quiet walk beyond the village. The woodland has begun changing almost without anyone noticing. Hazel trees were delicate catkins. The forest floor prepares for carpets of bluebells that will arrive later. The streams no longer hide beneath thin ice. They chatter softly over smooth stones. A woodpecker taps somewhere high above. Life returns in layers, never all at once. One leaf, one flower, one sunrise, until eventually the countryside feels alive again. Farmers understand that beauty also brings responsibility. The hardest work of the year is about to begin. Fields must be plowed, seeds planted, fences repaired after winter storms. Animals watched carefully during lambing season. There will be long days ahead, exhausting days, but they are welcomed gladly. Hard work in spring carries hope. Hard work in winter simply keeps hope alive. There is an important difference. One evening, as the family gathers around a familiar fire, someone notices something unusual. The firewood stack has stopped shrinking so quickly, not because there is suddenly more wood, because the days themselves have become warmer. A single log lasts longer. Nobody says much. There is no need. Everyone understands. Winter is slowly letting go. It never announces its departure. It simply stops visiting quite so often. An elderly grandmother looks toward the doorway where children are still playing outside, even though the sun is beginning to set. She smiles quietly. She remembers another spring from decades ago, then another, and another before that. She knows that people often believe great moments define life. Coronations, battles, victories. But looking around her family, she suspects life is really built from something much smaller. A shared meal, a repaired cloak, a warm fire, a healthy child laughing outside after surviving another difficult winter. History may never write songs about those things, but perhaps it should. As darkness settles gently over our village once more, the stars appear above Britain exactly as they have throughout every season. The fire crackles softly. The last of the winter winds drifts quietly across the fields. And somewhere beyond the horizon, spring is no longer a promise. It is finally becoming a reality. The longest season of waiting is almost over. Only one final chapter remains. And with it, our little village will step out of winter into another year of life. Well, here we are. After so many quiet evenings beside the fire, so many bowls of barley porridge, so many careful conversations about firewood, sheep smoke, damp boots, and stubborn geese, winter is finally beginning to loosen its grip. Not all at once. It never does. There is no magical morning when someone opens a door and suddenly discovers flowers everywhere, birds singing in perfect harmony, and warm sunshine politely waiting outside. Nature has always preferred patience. So does history. Instead, one morning, the frost simply doesn't appear. The next day, the puddles remain unfrozen. A week later, someone leaves their heavy cloak hanging by the doorway for an extra hour before deciding they actually don't need it just yet. The village doesn't celebrate. Not immediately. The people who have survived many winters know better. Britain has always enjoyed one final burst of cold, whether just when everyone begins trusting it again. Some traditions are older than kingdoms, so everyone waits, quietly, sensibly, and then, one afternoon, the fields begin changing color. Not dramatically, just enough that you notice. The dull browns of winter slowly give way to gentle greens. Grass pushes upward through the earth. The hedgerows begin waking from their long sleep. Tiny leaves unfold toward the pale spring sunshine. The great oak trees remain patient for a little longer. They have seen centuries come and go. They know there is no reason to rush. The birds, however, seem to disagree. Their songs return in greater numbers every morning. A blackbird claims the top of a fence post as though he has personally been appointed guardian of the village. A robin hops confidently across the yard. Swallows have not yet arrived, but everyone knows they will. Soon enough, always soon enough, the sheep become busier. Lambing season begins. Tiny white lambs, all impossibly energetic, discover their legs for the first time. For creatures that have existed on Earth for countless generations, newborn lambs always seem pleasantly surprised that walking is even possible. The children laugh. The adults smile, even if only for a moment before returning to work. Because spring is beautiful. It is also extraordinarily busy. The fields that rested through winter now demand attention. The oxen are brought from their shelters. Their heavy wooden yokes are checked one last time. Leather straps are tightened. The plow waits at the edge of the field. Months ago, this land lay frozen beneath frost. Now the soil has softened. The first furrow cuts slowly through the earth. It is not merely another farming task. It is the beginning of another year. Every straight line behind the plow carries hope. Every handful of seed placed into the soil is a quiet promise to the future. There are no guarantees. There never were. Storms may come. Rain may fail. Harvests may disappoint. But people plant anyway. Perhaps that is one of humanity's oldest acts of faith. Planting something you will not harvest for months. Trusting tomorrow without ever being able to see it. The village itself grows louder. Children spend longer outdoors. Doors remain open. The smell of fresh earth replaces the heavy scent of smoke that filled the air throughout winter. Women hang freshly washable blankets outside whenever the weather allows. The spring breeze carries away months of lingering smoke. Everything begins feeling lighter. Even the houses seem happier somehow. Perhaps it is only the sunlight reaching corners that winter kept hidden. Or perhaps homes really do notice the changing seasons. If walls could remember, these little timber houses would have remarkable stories to tell. They have watched babies become grandparents. They have heard wedding songs and funeral prayers. They have sheltered families through storms that are now remembered only in conversation. Every cracked beam, every smoke-blackened rafter, every worn wooden doorway has quietly witnessed ordinary lives becoming history. And perhaps that is exactly where history truly lives. Not only inside castles, not only inside royal courts, not only inside books copied by monks, but inside simple homes where ordinary people woke before dawn, tended the fire, shared their bread, mended their clothes, raised their children, and somehow found enough courage to do it all again the next morning. Kings came and went. Some ruled wisely. Others, well, let's just say a crown has never guaranteed good decision-making. History provides rather overwhelming evidence on that point. But while rulers argued over borders and titles, villages continued planting crops. Bakers continued kneading dough. Blacksmiths continued repairing tools. Shepherds continued following sheep that remained completely uninterested in politics. The world kept turning because ordinary people quietly refused to stop living. That may be the greatest lesson hidden inside Britain's dark ages. The period was not simply an age of battles or forgotten kingdoms. It was an age of families, of neighbors, of smoke rising from cottages every morning, of children learning from grandparents beside warm fires, of women spinning wool while telling stories, of monks patiently copying books that would survive for centuries, of farmers looking toward the sky and hoping the weather will be just a little kinder this year. History often remembers the loudest voices. Winter reminds us to listen for the quiet ones. If you had walked through our little village 1,000 years ago, nobody would have imagined that people living far in the future would someday wonder how they survived these long winters. To them, this wasn't history. It was simply Tuesday. The fire still needed feeding. The cows still needed milking. The roof still leaked a little whenever the rain became particularly enthusiastic. Life asked ordinary things from ordinary people, and somehow they answered again and again, year after year, generation after generation. Eventually, those generations became us. The roads changed. The houses changed. The kingdoms disappeared. Languages evolved. Empires rose and fell. Churches grew larger. Castles covered the hills. Cities expanded. Steam engines arrived. Railways crossed the countryside. Electric lights replaced smoky hearths. Central heating quietly performed the work that once required entire forests. Yet somewhere beneath all those changes, something remained wonderfully familiar. People still gather around warmth. Only now it might be a radiator instead of hearth. Families still share meals. Stories are still passed from one generation to another. Children are still fascinated by birds returning in spring. Neighbors still help one another after difficult winters. Some parts of being human never really change. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all. So, as the evening settles gently over our little village one last time, Smoke rises lazily into the cool spring air. The last stars appear above the British countryside. A dog curls beside the doorway after another long day. The sheep settle quietly in the meadow. The fire burns lower than it did during winter, needing less wood now that the nights have softened. Inside, a family finishes another simple meal. Someone tells an old story. The youngest child has already fallen asleep before reaching the ending. Nobody minds. The story will still be there tomorrow. Outside, the first gentle breeze of spring moves through the branches of the ancient oak trees. The village is safe. The winter has passed. Another season begins. And for the people who lived here, that was never a small victory. It was everything. So, if you wandered through these long winter months with me, through smoky cottages, frozen mornings, quiet monasteries, muddy roads, patient farmers, and countless ordinary lives, I hope you discovered something that history sometimes forgets to tell us. The greatest stories are not always about the people who changed the world. Sometimes they are about the people who simply kept it going. Now the fire is burned low, the house is quiet, the wind has grown gentle, and it is finally time to let our little village drift peacefully into the night. Sleep well, and thank you for keeping these forgotten lives company for a little while.